Welcome and thank you for joining us for this episode in the Fearless Minds research series focusing on the invisible, the unseen impacts of youth violence. I'm Terry Webb from Flinders University's Fearless Minds team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion as we explore the concept of invisible violence and its impact on the lives of our young people. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this discussion on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and that we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all the nations upon which Flinders operates. Now, this event is delivered as part of our Fearless Minds series. Throughout the series, you'll meet some of Flinders University's most engaging early to mid-career researchers as they bring you their latest research from a diverse range of fields. Today, we're fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Ben Lohmeyer, a researcher in youth violence and lecturer in social work in the College of Education, Psychology and Social Work here at Flinders. Before his academic career, Ben was a youth worker in the non-government sector, working with young people around issues of violence and justice in alternative education and accommodation. He's now an early career researcher and a member of the Flinders Social Work Innovation and Research Living Space, otherwise known as SWIRLS, a leading national work research centre. Ben, thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, when we think of youth violence, we might think of school bullying or youth gangs, but through your research, you step back from these sort of eye-catching behaviours, I suppose, and uncover where violence is an invisible and accepted part of Australian society. So basically, what is invisible violence and what is its impact on our young people?
Yeah, so invisible violence is really just shorthand, a way to try and draw attention to, like you said, those parts of our culture and our society that perhaps fit the patterns of violence. They perhaps justify or enable violence to happen, but we don't pay them as much attention. So when we think of violence, we usually think of things like physical fighting, harassment, those sort of, like I said, loud and shouty kind of things. But I'm interested in thinking a little bit more about the context that violence takes place. So some of the language that I'll use here are things like, say, institutionalized violence. So looking at our institutions that young people are part of and they inhabit, things like schools or perhaps prisons or a range of welfare agencies, and the ways that these institutions set up oppositions between the people who run the institution and the people who are in them. And this creates a kind of combative relationship right from the outset. Yeah. Or we might ask some questions about an idea like structural violence. So the ways that, so again, some systems and structures in our society create unequal life chances. So you have these violating experiences because I don't have equal access to, say, education or welfare or those sort of opportunities that you use to create a good life. Yeah. So those sort of contextual things, that's where my research sits. Rather than say, you mentioned youth gangs, this is something that gets attention in our media and it kind of comes up regularly, particularly around cycles like election cycles, things like this, because it's a set of language that has a certain moral panic to it, or is supposed to inspire a level of fear, despite the fact that usually these kinds of groups of young people, they don't actually fit the pattern of a gang. Like they don't operate, they're not organised in the same sort of way, and usually these headlines are attached to some sort of minority group or ethnicity, perhaps just something about the colour of their skin that gives them away as being a target or an interest for media attention and overlooks the range of contextual factors and within their life. So these kind of things I want to step away from and pay more attention to, again, the systems and the social context that creates the opportunity for these things to happen and impacts people's lives in harmful ways.
Cool. Just on institutionalized violence, when we and I'm digressing here, sorry, slightly.
No, great.
You mentioned prisons and schools and different areas like that. We generally not think of schools as being a place where violence would be institutionalized. Can you expand on that slightly?
Sure, yeah. I mean, largely we kind of think of schools as a fairly non-violent place and non-violent space, but part of my research is interested in things like school bullying. And there's a report from the Department of Education in 2019 that showed in South Australian schools, half of young people in years 4 to 10 experience bullying every month. Half of young people.
Wow.
So that's a pretty high statistic. And your bullying is a global issue, and even globally, it's fairly common. I think that there's a World Health Organization, a report from 2020 that said 1 in 3 young people experience bullying and violence monthly in schools. So we think of them as non-violent spaces, but there are things happening in schools which perhaps aren't getting the attention that they really need.
Yeah. I think a lot of people probably consider the more visible aspects of violence and that things like video games, that movies, that television, all those examples of violence that they can quite easily see and comprehend are causing the biggest impact. Is that the case?
Yeah, again, this kind of response to violent video games is similar to the response to youth gangs. It's this moral panic over perhaps a set of young people's culture or latest activities. So something like violent video games, there's been a lot of research done on that as well over many, many years. And the contemporary research basically says to say that there is a causal connection between playing a video game and being violent is really just the wrong way to approach the problem. It's far kind of too simplistic, if that makes sense. A more interesting question would be something like, how does the story or the ways, attitudes towards violence that we have in those games are reflected of broader patterns and structures and stories that we tell about violence and domination in our culture? Yeah. And so if we perhaps even just broaden the scope a little bit from games to other forms of entertainment, we can think about things like sporting cultures and sporting entertainment in Australia. Really important part of Australian culture is sport. And I really enjoy going to the footy. Port Adelaide is great. And that's a great experience.
Port Adelaide, really?
Okay, so Port Adelaide, that's just the team I've chosen. The sport is a really good example of where there are behaviours on the field that perhaps if we translated them into a schoolyard wouldn't be acceptable. So we think about footy and we think about the physical contact and even just the aggressive behaviours. If young people did that in the schoolyard, of course, they'd get in trouble for it. And that kind of makes sense. And perhaps there's something about you go to a sporting match and you cross that white line, you go onto the field and you participate in that kind of activity voluntarily. So perhaps there it's not violence. But I'm not convinced that distinction that white line gives us is really so clear. Because if we go to the footy and we observe, then we unfortunately still see fights that happen in the crowds, right? Or we see some really aggressive kind of insults that come across the white line from the crowd to not just officials, but also players. There are instances recently of players, after losing a game on social media, get death threats. This kind of distinction between violence that's okay there and not okay in the rest of society, I'm not convinced is always so clear. Yeah. So I think if we're going to point our finger at things like video games, we have to have a broader picture as well of the way that we think about violence in our culture, and particularly the way that we kind of respond to young people too. There's some great, really important social movements taking place right now that are young people led, like the global climate strike movement. We've got these young people who are highly engaged politically and they want to come out and ask something for their future. And the response that we get from particularly political elites in the media and our politics is often very negative and dismissive of their activities. And so if that's the way we treat young people in that space, we've got to think a little bit more about how we value people and what are harmful behaviours and where are the contradictions, I think, in our activities.
If we can just step back into the school environment, one of your recent research projects is involved working with high school students to discuss their experiences and understanding of bullying in the school environment. What sort of insights did you gain from that?
Yeah, that was a really interesting and insightful project because, as I've already mentioned, bullying is a really important topic. It has some very annoying, sort of frustrating statistics around it that we want to create some change. And there has been a lot of study on it. I think from a study in 2017 found that there was in the 6 years leading up something like 5,000 articles written about bullying globally. So it's attracted a fair bit of attention. But there is really one way that continues to dominate bullying research and policy, and that's to focus on this kind of behavioural psychological components of it. My research has a more sociological, social context focus, and it's part of this new wave of bullying research, which is really interested in exploring and focusing on young people's experiences first, rather than starting with this technical adult-derived kind of understanding of bullying. So the great thing about the kind of research that I do is I get to sit and listen to young people's stories, and they tell me about their experiences kind of at length, which is a lot of fun and really interesting, even when it's a tough topic. And so young people will tell me stories about bullying where the spaces and the times in which bullying happened were really important. So where it took place in the school and their experience of bullying that perhaps the bullying itself doesn't reoccur, but even revisiting the space where it occurred can be an experience of harm, if that makes sense, or seeing the person again in the schoolyard, even though they're not bullying me again, just being there triggers that experience, yeah. Or the design of a school where a couple of young people told a story of a school that has this long corridor that runs down the middle of the whole school. And if something that was like violence or bullying happened in the school, it can very quickly be communicated across the school. And then, of course, people rush there to the experience. And so the bullying and the violence escalates quickly because there's so many kind of people around. And so those spaces and times become really important. But also the way that we design schools or the systems and institutions of schools, kind of like I was talking about before, where there are oppositions built into the structure of a school. And one of those oppositions are the difference between teachers and students. And students, the participants in my research, would tell some stories where teachers had used perhaps humour or teasing kind of behaviours as a way to control or manage a classroom, which were intended to be fun or relational, but weren't experienced that way by the students. And then if the students were to replicate that kind of behaviour, again, they'd get in trouble for it because it's considered bullying. So those kinds of social dynamics are really important in our understanding of bullying. We're only really just beginning to explore them. And the other part of that is something about young people, right? Like, who are the people in schools? Well, they're young people. That's inherently part of the schooling experience, is that you're young, and that's mandated in South Australia. You're under a certain age, you have to go to school, and so there's something important there as well. And the students would tell me, the young people would tell me about how their understanding of bullying is as something done by younger people, and often younger than themselves, which was interesting. But then they went on to describe bullying as a PG-13 version of violence, which is kind of an interesting phrase. Connecting to the kind of media classification codes, you've got your M-leveled violence, which is more mature and perhaps a bit more real. But the PG stuff is kind of not really real. It's kind of the immature thing that immature people do. So there's something about the word bullying that's attached to younger people. And when asked what that was about, there's one student in particular went on to say, well, as you get older, you learn to transition or transform your violence and bullying into more acceptable forms, more invisible forms, perhaps. Maybe another way of saying it is you get better at it. You get better at managing those social dynamics, but not in a good way, but in a negative, hidden kind of way.
You just become more subtle at you.
Exactly. Yeah, you just become more subtle. So you might even think back to, perhaps your own experience in school, and I'm sure you remember there was always a class clown or a naughty kid of some sort in the classroom, and they would very readily and easily kind of get in trouble for things that they would do. But there may have also been a popular student who could perhaps use similar sort of aggressive or mean or teasing behaviours, but they got away with it, and perhaps even were encouraged or supported in their behaviours by the institution or the authority in their space. Again, as a way of kind of continuing to manage the student body. And it's important not to kind of say it's the teacher's fault in all of this, because the teachers are as much part of the social context as the students are. And my interest is less in the behaviours of those individuals and more, again, the institutions and structures that kind of set these kind of behaviours up.
So as the uninitiated, how do we begin to respond and understand and see this invisible violence, and whose responsibility is it to deal with this?
It's a really important question as part of the conversation here. Whose responsibility is it to deal with it? And the question kind of flows in then, who are the people who we target to be the focus of change? Because if we target young people and say they need to change, perhaps we run like an education campaign of some sort, whether it's around something like bullying or even just domestic violence. These are education campaigns that happen in schools at the moment. What we're saying is if we're doing that, we're educating young people, we're saying that they have the wrong ideas or values and that they need to change those. So you're essentially saying young people are the problem in that. And perhaps we could focus instead on something like, well, what is the structure or institution that creates this space? Perhaps the structure is the problem rather than the young person.
Yeah.
Similarly, who gets to do the change? Do we take young people's voices seriously in this space? Could they be involved in the changing of our institutions? Do we have the conviction to want to change and figure out these problems that we might give them a chance to lead in that space? If we did, we'd probably end up with a result that's not exactly what we wanted. Like, it certainly wouldn't be exactly how I would design it.
Yeah.
But if we're wanting to solve these problems and we're wanting to give young people meaningful voice, we kind of have to take that risk.
As a sociology researcher, you've obviously dealt with many different types of youth over the years. How much has it changed? How much more difficult is it now to be a young person than it was, say, 10 or 20 years ago?
It's a great question. It's also a really big question. So obviously there's quite a large amount of diversity in young people's experiences in Australia. And as a sociologist, I have to be skeptical, I think, of making too big a generalizations. In my research, I'm particularly interested in, and something I like to spend time on, is marginalised young people's experiences. And I think it's clear if you look at their lives and their access to some of these public institutions that are an important part of the way we think about Australia, there is unfortunately a trend towards valuing and creating these institutions through kind of a market-based thought process to solve social problems, which is tricky. And I'll kind of give you an example. So I was visiting recently a colleague who worked in a government department and having some conversations with them about a service, and I also happened to meet with one of the contract managers in that space for a youth service that the department outsources to non-government organisations to run. Fairly common process that we have at the moment for delivering youth services. And the contract manager proudly told me how they'd created a market of competing non-government organisations to deliver the service. So this is creating a market for youth services. And the product of doing that is you get people trying to deliver the most service for the kind of least amount of money, if that makes sense, which is great. We should spend government money efficiently. We should spend it well, which is good. But efficiency as a value is kind of in opposition to quality service delivery to the most marginalised people. You can't have a focus on delivering as much as you can if you have a practice which is about caring and listening and being present to people. You end up measuring how much service you delivered rather than whether you actually helped anybody.
Yeah.
And people who are youth workers and social workers end up becoming process machines instead of kind of caring, listening individuals. Young people end up being the problem rather than the context they're in being the problem. So that shift towards market-based ways of thinking in social services, I think, is having a negative impact on the lives of young people, and particularly those marginalised groups.
Is that just a political pressure?
Yeah, in many ways. It's this dominant political way of thinking about problems, and kind of those market-based ways of thinking are easier to sell in an election cycle of sorts. But we need more researchers and practitioners who are able to stand up and say, hang on, that actually doesn't work when you're trying to offer this kind of support and service to people. You will end up with locking people out of certain kinds of access. So, you won't get education as a right that everybody has access to simply because they're a human and a citizen in Australia. Instead, certain people get better access to other education than others. And that's not okay. We've got to change that.
Now, as a researcher, you graduated your PhD in sociology in 2018. What advice would you give to somebody pursuing or thinking of pursuing a research career in the field today?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is build a broad network. Get to know as many people as you can. And that includes your fellow researchers, absolutely get to know them and learn from them. But you also need to build a broad network with the people who you're hoping will use your research. Who are the professionals in the youth sector that you want to get that out to? Who are the gatekeepers there as well? Because that can often impact whether you get access to participants and other resources that you need. So go and enjoy having conversations with people who understand the value of what you're doing, can find some mutual value there, who are good people as well as important people to get to know. And that can just be a whole lot of fun as well. Like, that's actually a really enjoyable experience. Go and have some coffees, ask some interesting questions, be interested in what people are doing. I think networks are one of the most important things.
Ben, I'd like to just say thank you very much for your time today.
Nice.
Dr. Ben Lohmeyer has shared his time and knowledge with us. Remember, you can watch any of our Fearless Minds episodes on our Flinders YouTube channel. I encourage you to do so, so please keep an eye out for the next one. Thank you again, Ben, and bye for now.